Grüezi Amerika, Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brüwiler. Grüezi, and welcome to a new episode of Views from the Sister Republic. For once, I'm not recording this episode at the University of St. Gallen or at home in Winterthur, but I'm a guest at Assumption University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And yes, those of you who listen to the podcast regularly have indeed heard of Assumption University before. It's the academic home of my interview partners in episode 13, Professor Michel Lemons and Professor Lee Trepanier. The latter is my first guest to return to the podcast, so my first repeat offender. Welcome back, dear Lee, and thank you for the hospitality.
Thank you for inviting me back, and welcome to Assumption University.
We originally did not plan to get together twice within less than a month, but Lee thankfully agreed to come on a bit early onto the podcast to discuss the federal funding cuts in higher education. I already mentioned during that conversation how the European perception of the State of the Union has darkened considerably. According to prominent observers and journalists, we are witnessing Sinclair Lewis's dystopian novel of 1935 come true. It can't happen here illustrated how the United States can descend into authoritarianism, how what had happened in Germany could indeed happen in the US as well. Some political scientists label the US political system no longer as a democracy, but as a case of so-called competitive authoritarianism, meaning there are still elections, but these elections only lead to an authoritarian government of either coloring. Prominent scholars like historian Timothy Snyder have already left the United States for greener shores in Canada in his case. He's now with the University of Toronto. And that has again inspired comparisons to the Third Reich. Some are calling it die Gleichschaltung der Universitäten, or saying that this has been following the Gleichschaltung der Medien, so that all the media are meant to heel to the president's demands. And some doubt that the system of checks and balances can withstand the Trump administration. Some argue that the system has actually already crumbled. And then there are people, even at my own University of St. Gallen, who consider a new civil war a real possibility and say so openly in the press. Could go on, and Lee has already a very pained expression. So, Lee, you are an American citizen. You're a classic liberal. How surprised are you by these extremely dystopian visions of America? Are you living in fascist America already?
I would say that we're not living in fascist America already. I think that the portrayals by the media and others that we're headed towards authoritarianism or fascism is overstated. I would explain it more as, certainly half the country, for example, doesn't think that we're a fascist country. The other half may so. So Donald Trump is a very polarizing figure in the American public and certainly worldwide. But I think what's happened is that you had essentially the commanding heights of culture, the university, the press, entertainment, that's been dominated and sort of controlled by the left and far left, and they are now being directly attacked by the Trump administration. I would say albeit crudely and in ways that I would not probably agree with. But I think they're reacting to that, and in some ways they're I would say overreacting. There may be some cause for concern, but I think it's too early to say yet.
Let me push back on this a bit, even though I have to say I'm also among those who often say that we're not looking at this very soberly and that there is a bit of hysteria going on. But if we're looking at the system of checks and balances, isn't there really cause for concern? Because we see a president who could very easily work with Congress since he has a majority. He has a party that is now very much aligned and happy with the direction he is taking, with the exception of the tariffs we've learned. So why is he relying so heavily on executive orders? And why hasn't he, for instance, sought a mandate by Congress for Doge?
So I think Trump has relied upon executive orders because if you try to enact any legislation, it probably wouldn't pass. There are factions and disagreement within the Republican Party. And one of the ironies is that by relying on the executive orders, it's not permanent. So the next president who's elected, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, can easily overturn and roll back those executive orders. So it's I wouldn't worry too much about it. I mean, some of the executive orders I disagree with, but if you have someone that comes in after him, they can easily rescind them in that way. In terms of being the same party, Congress and the president, and that's normal, whether it's Democrat or Republican, they're going to be on the same page, at least for the initial 2 years until the midterms. I think what I would ask your listeners to look at is really the court system. The court is really the great check against unified government in Congress and the presidency. And we've seen judges rule against the Trump administration time and time and again. So I think it's a healthy sign that the checks and balances are working. Now, it'll be troubling if the Trump administration that the court has ruled against the Trump administration does it anyways. Then that's a troubling sign. But we haven't seen anything like that yet.
To what extent do you believe that Trump will really respect the courts? I mean, his vice president has tweeted things, or I think you can no longer say tweet, but you know what I mean. He has posted things saying that, well, if the president does it, it is the law, essentially. These are Nixon's words, but J.D. Vance essentially echoed them. So do you really trust this government to obey the courts?
I think it's too early to tell, but at this moment, they haven't. They've followed the court's orders, and they've been following the judicial process. So there's no evidence to suggest they would act otherwise. But again, if they do, I think that is a cause for concern. But at this point, I think when journalists are looking at Congress and expecting Congress to act contrary to what the president wants when they're of the same party is sort of ridiculous. We wouldn't ask the same thing, for example, when the Democrats controlled Congress, if they would act contrary to what when Obama was president or Biden was president. So that's natural. But I think the courts is a key element, and I think the jury's still out. But at this time, there's no evidence that, rhetoric aside, that the Trump administration would violate court orders.
I'd like to push back a bit against what you said regarding expecting Congress to act against its own president. We have seen that, though, during the first Trump administration, that when he wanted to dismantle Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, that he completely failed because Congress wouldn't cooperate. And this time around, we also see members of Congress who would like to curtail his ability to use emergency laws to have tariffs indefinitely. So I think we should bit also expect his own party to be a bit of a loyal opposition at times, shouldn't we?
I would agree with that, but let's take the Obamacare example. And that was in his first term when really the Republican Party was sort of going through, and still is going through, an identity crisis. I think now the Republican Party is clearly in the MAGA camp, whereas in his first term, it was split. And we have to also remember in the specifics that it was John McCain who was the deciding vote that in the Senate that voted against Trump's to abolish Obamacare. So now I think it's hard to say, quite frankly. It's, we certainly, we want Congress to sort of protect its prerogatives. I think you're right on the tariffs. We already see some movement on that with some of the Republicans wanting Congress to reclaim that power. But we'll have to see if, I think those cases will happen if the Trump administration oversteps. And then it's so blatant that probably Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, will want to reclaim the power as an institution of Congress. But at this point, I don't, as acting as a loyal opposition, we're not a parliamentary system. It doesn't quite work that way. And really the nature of the Republican Party has changed more into Donald Trump's image. So it's less likely that's going to happen.
And what about the actual opposition? I mean, the checks and balances only work as well as the actors use them. And one is really puzzled by the state of the Democratic Party. You've already mentioned that the Republicans have undergone their own identity crisis. And now one feels that the same is happening with the Democratic Party at the worst possible moment when they're not in power. How do you feel about their current state? And do you agree with me that this is also damaging the system as such at the moment, that the Democrats are not really finding a recipe to put a check on presidential power to the extent it is possible, given that they are in the minority at the moment?
Well, the Democrats are undergoing an identity crisis, which is natural after you lose a presidential election. It's going to take them probably a cycle or two before they really decide what they stand for in terms of their values, whether there would be a very progressive party or a leftist center party. And that's a debate they're fighting out, and it's going to take some time for that to happen. But in terms of acting as the opposition, what they could do is provide a coherent alternative policies that what the Republicans and Trump are offering. But because of the internal fighting, they're not able to. So that certainly weakens them. I think one thing we also fail to forget is that we're a federal republic. So if you're looking for places sort of opposing Trump and their policies, other than the courts, we can look at sort of the states. And certainly those states that are blue, that are Democratic in the legislature and in the governorships, it's like Massachusetts or Wisconsin, Michigan, you see them act in pass policies and act in ways and in cooperating and not cooperating with the federal government as a type of resistance or alternative policies to what the Trump administration is offering. But I agree with you. Nationally, it's going to take probably a cycle or two before the Democrats can figure out who they are and how they're going to provide an alternative to MAGA.
A cycle or two. I just think what you're saying here is probably scaring a lot of people in Europe who would like this to end as quickly as possible. Yesterday, when I was driving up here, I listened to NPR's show The Middle, where people were saying how the first 100 days of Trump, well, we're not quite there yet, but that these first 100 days that we're still in have felt like 100 years or 100 months, that it's too much, that it is also exhausting to many. And quite frankly, in Europe, where we do have a distance between the things that are happening here, but we've also been exhausted. We've been following one executive order after the next, and people are concerned about what is going on and are losing trust in the solidity of American institutions. So while you say that a lot of what Trump is doing can be rescinded, etc., isn't there something more fundamental that is being damaged through the way he is governing, where one might say, well, this isn't really a damage to the checks and balances, but that it might affect the American democracy as such more profoundly?
Well, I think I think that's a legitimate criticism. I think it does it in two ways. First, it sort of the Trump flood the zone approach to policy, as it does, it's not only exhausting, but does lead to a greater distrust of government by the general American public. But having said that, the American public did have very low levels of trust with the federal government in the first place. So I don't think it's that much of a difference. I think where it's more important is overseas, where the United States is seen as type of a democracy of stability and sobriety, and that's being undermined by sort of Trump's tactics of implementing these policies, and that's very dangerous, not only for the United States, but really for the West in a lot of ways. And we can see this, and one sort of small indication of this would be sort of the bond market and sort of the loss of trust in buying U.S. bonds by foreigners, and so they see that the American regime is less stable, and so I think that is worrisome, and the way that sort of the strong rhetoric of the Trump administration and sort of as you said, executive order after executive order. It does lead to a type of sort of a madcap appearance of what they're doing. So that is dangerous and has certainly foreign policy and worldwide consequences.
You've already used the word mad here. Is there a method to the madness, is what a lot of people are wondering. I mean, on the one hand, there's on the one hand this question, is there a bigger plan afoot? Everyone has talked about Project 2025 to overhaul American democracy, to destroy American democracy, or on the other hand, is this just a madman trying whatever hat fits him best?
Just to clarify, I said the appearance of madness. I did say he was mad. It's hard to know. This is only my impression, is that I think Trump is acts out of instincts. And he's undisciplined. So as far as sort of his policies, for example, the tariffs, and people, if some of his supporters argue that this is three-dimensional chess and so on and so forth, I'm a little skeptical of that. I think he's just sort of reacted to the moment and sort of relying on his instinct. And this is obviously worrisome for those who want sort of public policy to be coherent and effective. At the other time, it should be somewhat comforting to know that this is not a part of a long-term strategic plan by the Trump administration to sort of remake the whole federal government or democracy in that way. I could be mistaken, but that's sort of my impression, is that it really is sort of the undisciplinedness of his approach suggests that it's more of a reactive mode than sort of something someone who sort of methodically plans out changing the government.
Reactive is also an adjective that lends itself to the word backlash. And you've mentioned in the beginning already that a lot of the reaction that we're getting that is rather dystopian and hopeless, etc., is an expression of frustration with the backlash that a certain class in the United States is witnessing. Can you maybe explain a bit to what extent you consider the current policy changes as an expression of backlash?
So I'll provide maybe an example to illustrate this. When we had the pandemic in the United States, we had federal officials sort of declared that, stay-at-home policy, children had to wear masks, so on and so forth. And they did it in the name of science. And then also anyone who argued or claimed that, or questioned whether the pandemic was came from the lab and wasn't from nature were shunned in that way. Now we know that some of the policies that were enacted were pretty damaging. For example, we know that children who had to do school online will probably never recover in their education. We've seen that in some cases masks were not effective. We know recently that the pandemic was made in a lab in China. But when those prior claims were made in the name of science, and so now when those are seen not to have worked or not to be true, the authority and legitimacy of claims in the name of science is weakened. People are less trustful. And I think you see that not only in science, for example, but you also see in culture. With Hollywood, they're making certain claims. You see it with the universities and higher education that are sort of left and far left. And when you see that the federal government is providing alternative policies and going after them, for example, of universities, terminating federal contracts of hundreds of millions of dollars, the American public in some ways say, well, we trusted you before and you betrayed that trust. And so why should we care about your situation now? So I think it is somewhat of a backlash to those institutions that overstepped, and Trump is a manifestation of that.
But you've just mentioned science. This backlash now is severe, and it is going to undermine some of the foundations of American success. Institutions that are at the top of world rankings are being are being targeted quite directly. They're losing some of their best talents. They're losing programs that they in the past been able to fund. Is that really something that Americans on average think is just payback for what happened, or payback for what they previously experienced as a mislaid trust? Or does that go beyond what people actually find worthy of support?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, because I think the way that American higher education is seen by the public is very complicated and diverse. I mean, on the one hand, yes, I think it is damaging when these federal contracts are cut off. But my sense is probably with the American public, if they're in the humanities or it's a lesser extent the social sciences, the American public is probably indifferent. It really, when it deals with science and technology and engineering, is when they care about. And so when you see, say, American professors who flee the American university system, if they're in humanities and social sciences, I think most people really don't, quite frankly, are too concerned about that. Now, if it's a leading a biologist or a leading someone in technology, that would be a cause for concern. So I think first and foremost, it depends on the discipline in that regard. Secondly, I think that there's been this push in the last 40 years in the United States where everyone should go to college, right? Everyone should have a college degree. And there was a real devaluing of vocational work or technical work. We're seeing a change of that. For example, in our high school system, we see a rise in vocational high school programs, and they're very popular in that way. So the sort of value of the college degree is changing. Now, it's still valuable, or studies have shown time and time again over a lifetime, someone with a college degree makes $1 million more than someone who doesn't. But that debate is changing somewhat. And then third, I think when you had the protests against Israel during the war in the Middle East, that did a lot to discredit universities' authority and legitimacy in the American public, rightly or wrongly. And so I think for those factors, it might be for a certain segment of the population, it's a backlash, but I think for the broad swath of the public, is other sort of long, deep-seated structural factors that they're reacting to.
It's interesting that you're coming back to the protests against Israel, because the context as to why I'm here in the United States at all is that I attended with students National Model United Nations. And we had, as an opening speaker, for those who are not familiar with this is a simulation of the United Nations. Students represent different countries and try to assume the role of diplomats of said countries in different UN committees and negotiate solutions for the world's most pressing issues. And as an opening speaker, we had someone defend the work of UNRWA. And she managed to talk about the conflict in Gaza without mentioning Hamas once. And she only once alluded to what she called, I quote, the heinous acts of October 7th. And there was no mentioning that this was the biggest assault on Jewish life since the Holocaust. And I criticized that speech in the faculty feedback session. This was a room full of, I would say, 250 professors, mostly Americans. The majority in the room, the overwhelming majority, there were maybe 3 or 4 people who agreed with me. They had no problem that Hamas was not mentioned. So I was really struck by the direction American discourse has taken on Israel, at least in this pocket of society who should know better. But that's an aside. It's just it just struck me because I do think that particularly Americans who do have strong ties with Israel and Americans who are Christians have probably a very different outlook on Israel as such than academics in the most prestigious institutions. I don't know whether you'd like to comment on that, just as an aside.
No, it reminds me of sort of 19th century imperial Russia, where you had the intelligentsia and the serfs, and there's a great gap between the values of the serfs and the intelligentsia. And we see something like this here in the United States today, where it's those in academia, they just have a value system that's very different than the average citizen in the American public. And so, for at the universities, when they see the protests and they see the encampments, I think that, from their perspective, they see this as normal and validating. But from, those who aren't in academia, it's seen as at best indulgent and at worst as, anti-Semitic. So it is a clash of I think, two different groups and how they see the event.
At the same time, one has to say, coming back to our original topic, namely the state of American democracy, that there is a case to be made that now those who claim that their freedom of speech, their freedom of thought had been limited, had been disrespected by the so-called elites, that they are now actually curtailing freedom of speech and freedom of thought and academic freedom. So how can one bring this together to make sense, that it is now a conservative administration that says these are the words that you may use and these are the forbidden words?
Yeah, I think it's problematic. I think that's a fair criticism. I mean, I think you have, in terms of freedom of speech and academic freedom and so on, I mean, you have really intolerance on both sides. So certainly on the left, when they were in government, and certainly they still are, run most of the universities, they have the person pursuing a very, sort of politically correct, or however you want to phrase it, woke agenda. And then, for the conservatives who come to power on the right, they're going to do the opposite and revert back to more sort of, I guess, traditional type of words. So it's very difficult to try to make sense and what is, freedom of speech and where the balance is in that way. I myself would probably say this, just open it up and just have it, everyone, whether it's on the left or right, remove those intolerances, or have a sort of free market of ideas. But it's but that's easier to say than to do, because we know sort of the pragmatics, certainly at a university, when you have cases of evaluation and tenure and promotion, those things come into play for better or worse. So it's a great problem that we're still trying to muddle through. But I would just say to your listeners that the intolerance on freedom of speech happens on both sides.
So you're not concerned on that regard, that suddenly also the media have to be concerned, for instance, if we're looking at the Washington Post, that someone like Jeff Bezos is intervening and saying, well, we have to change our editorial outlook on certain questions, or, certain topics are off the agenda now in universities, etc. Is this just now we are flipping the coin and it's the same situation just with different ideological connotations, or do you sense that there might be something more sinister afoot?
I think it's more flipping the coin. I think the Washington Post is a different example, because you have an owner of the paper who's telling how he wants to run his business. So I think that's perfectly legitimate. We may agree or disagree with that, but certainly within his right. It's not a public utility. But in terms of universities, yeah, I think it is, whether the left or right is in power, they'll sort of push their agenda one way or the other. I do think there is hope, though. I don't want to be completely despondent in this podcast, is that we do see a movement, really both from the left and the right in various pockets, of trying to talk about civil discourse and talking through our disagreements. And we see these sort of initiatives sprout out throughout the country. And I think that's in recognition that, we really need to have a genuine exchange of ideas in a way that people feel comfortable and safe to express them. But that's going to take some time for that to germinate and mature.
I'm trying to take a bit of a bird's eye view again of what has been going on during the nearly last 100 days. I'm trying to find historic parallels to what Donald Trump has been doing, and I've been really struggling. And whenever I do think I found a parallel, people take a lot of offense with the kind of parallels. I do find out, because one that comes to my mind is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who greatly expanded the administrative state, who thus expanded executive power and did so against the opposition. He was likened to a tyrant and a king, etc. It's just that history looked very mercifully on how he did this. I was also thinking maybe that maybe there are parallels to Nixon's presidency, or at least Richard Nixon's perception of what a president is allowed to do. When we were thinking of that famous sentence, when the president does it, it is legal. But do you see any worthy predecessors of Trumpian ambition, a president that we can compare to Trump, or is Trump in a league of his own?
Yeah, it's difficult to think of examples. I think FDR is a great example. I would say, just generally speaking, when you see, for example, what Trump is trying to do is trying to sort of curb back or dismantle the administrative state in the federal government, is that we see this most often happen in U.S. history after times of war, right? So after the Civil War, World War I, World War II, there's a rapid sort of rescinding of the federal government because we weren't at war anymore. We haven't seen anything like this done in sort of peacetime or in the federal bureaucracy that's not directly dealing with war. And so this is the first where we see Trump really the first president to try to intentionally dismantle non-military departments in the federal government. So I think that's unique. In terms of executive powers, I would argue that this is a troubling trend we've seen really since probably starting with George W. Bush, where you see the number of executive orders being issued under George W. Bush, then Barack Obama, and then Joe Biden, and then Trump have increased over time. And that's worrisome because although I said earlier that it can be rescinded with the next president, so in that case, it's not so worrisome. Yeah. But on the other hand, it's worrisome because it suggests that Congress has really sort of foregone its power and is given it to the executive branch, whether it's a Democratic Congress or a Republican Congress. So I think that's very worrisome.
Do you see any possibility to turn that wheel back, that Congress reasserts its power, or is there no possibility to see that happen, particularly given the polarized political system that we have right now?
I don't see it in the immediate future unless Trump oversteps so grossly that Congress has to act in that way. But it's hard to foresee that in the future. I think part of it is that with the United States after World War II becoming a global power, those decisions and those responsibilities reside in the executive branch primarily. And so naturally, the presidency is going to expand in power. So I think structurally, the only way it probably would work if the United States were to withdraw from the world, Congress would probably could reassert itself. This is something I'm not advocating for. Just want to make that clear. But I think it's just in terms of the relationship between Congress and the president, that's probably the only way it may happen. Again, unless Trump grossly overreaches and Congress has no other option than to react.
I don't want to speculate on what a gross overreach might be. Because a lot of people have already asserted there have been all of these overreaches, and it gets a bit tiresome to discuss why there haven't been any in this administration so far. There are good reasons to argue against that statement. But what would interest me also is how you see the way we're talking about this current political moment, because I personally feel that there is a bit of a, how shall I say, a tendency to be very hyperbolic in language in Europe at the moment, whereas I felt that we have passed that stage in the United States, because you're living probably with the situation as well. And I was wondering how you are seeing this. Do we see a cooling down of the language that is in use because people have also gotten tired of hearing words used that are not fitting for what is happening? Or am I maybe seeing this a bit too rosily. For instance, I'm thinking of the F word fascism that is nowadays used in some media in the German-speaking part of the world as if this were an accurate description of what is happening in the United States, where you also get really quickly accused of diminishing what is happening, of downplaying what is happening if you're not saying this is a tech oligarchy.
I think you're spot on. I think what's happened is that the language that is used, the hyperbolic language that is being used by the press and by others, is used so often that it loses any of its impact over time. It's sort of the boy who cried wolf in that sense. I think also the reality is that people who live in the United States, who live their daily lives, most citizens don't think about what the federal government's doing in that way, unless they're directly affected by it, then they do. So, but otherwise, it's really what state government, local government, that's you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis and that way. And that in some ways matters more than what the federal government does, even though paradoxically the federal government gets all the media coverage. So it is similar to the way that the word fascism is similar to what's happened to the word racism, right? People have been called racist in so many different ways that the charge is sort of meaningless at this point. And so, how do we come back from this, or how do we recover from this? I would just ask all of us to take a step back and try to think more carefully and deliberately when we use language, and what do we mean by it, and how do we define it, and what's the evidence to support our definition. It's probably going to be more persuasive in the long run than sort of saying certain words just to charge people up for that particular moment.
That's a very lovely reminder. I don't even want to go beyond that, because it's also a very positive thought, I think, because it implies that we can move beyond the acerbic and very hateful at times debates that we've been having. But before we close, what would you recommend our listeners to read, listen to, or watch to make better sense of the current political moment, or maybe learn how to think differently about it, how we apply language, for instance?
So when I was in high school, my senior year, I took a political science class by Mr. Cooper, one of the best classes I've taken, not only in high school, but one of the best political science classes I've ever taken, period.
Oh, you're a high school teacher. That's nice.
And what he recommended is that he said something to us, which I've never forgot. He said, if you're a liberal, you should read the Wall Street Journal every day. And if you're a conservative, you should read the New York Times every day. And I think that's really important. And when I get my news sources, I get from a variety of sources, left, right, and middle. And I would certainly encourage your listeners to do the same, is that we don't want to fall into these echo chambers, which is even more, it's very easy to do now with sort of that way that markets have been spliced and the use of technology. So, and then when we do read things from from viewpoints that we disagree with, instead of immediately disagreeing with them, perhaps try to be a little empathetic and try to imagine, okay, well, why do they say that? Why do they make the argument? What is their perspective? Try to see where they're coming from. And you still may disagree with them at the end, but I think that's a healthy exercise. This is something we're trying to do at the universities, through civil discourse initiatives and things of that sort, where we're trying to not just immediately respond to an argument that we disagree with, but try to understand the other perspective, and from there try to find some common ground where we can have a genuine discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lee. Thank you for your time and hospitality here in beautiful Worcester, Massachusetts, where it still has snow. With that, I thank all those who are listening, probably looking into Swiss springtime landscape or German springtime landscape. Thank you for sticking with us, and auf Wiedersehen.
Grüezi Amerika, views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brühwiler.